And thank you, Evan, for this paper. I learned a lot from the paper. It's a very ambitious paper, and you're running a big and complex argument. So I'd like to focus in on part 4, the spirit part of the paper. And so the first thing is, I think, just a suggestion, I think this whole section will be clearer if you identify the shape of the zone of underdeterminacy that your theory of the spirit is dealing with. I lost the connection between the letter section and the spirit section. Second suggestion is, I think you got to put something back in about your methodological approach to the spirit. The theory that you and Randy offer in the letter in the spirit is about objective function, right? The idea that, so the idea would be that the text is like an artifact, it's like a watch, and once we have the communicative content of the text, then we can postulate the function that that text is intended to serve. One of the reasons to go for that approach is to avoid the problems that are that you get if you're looking for the actual purposes of the advocates of the provision. Once you're talking about actual purposes, then you've got a whole set of levels of generality problems that you could avoid by identifying the function that is tailored to the actual design of the constitutional provision. And you have the problem that there are many purposes and that there's a serious divide between actual purposes, between moderate and radical Republicans. And this is a point that Kurt Lash, of course, makes in a very compelling way. And the purpose that you identify, the anti-subjugation principle that you identify, which I didn't really understand fully, it just sounds like it's too broad to fit the communicative content of the provision. And it seems to me that this is a multi-clause provision, so that you need to, when you specify the function of the equal protection of the laws clause, I think you need to explain how that function is related to and different from the functions of the due process clause and the privileges and immunities clause. And all of these clauses bear relationships to the citizenship clause. So it's a great paper, but I just think that this part of the paper needs some clarifying work. I really was having a hard time seeing how you were carrying out your own methodology in this part of the paper.
Richard Fallon.
Thanks, Evan. It's a very stimulating paper, as I'm sure everybody agrees. I have 3 quick interrelated comments. The first is very close to the one that Larry just made, and that is to say, I'm not sure I understand the relationship between how you think of, how you identify what you think is determinate in the meaning of the Equal Protection Clause and what you think is underdeterminate, such that you are in the zone in which we have to be paying attention to the spirit. The second closely related comment is, I'm a little bit puzzled about what the criterion for determinacy is, in the following sense. Yesterday we had an exchange, and I don't mean to be trying to rehash that here, but I guess somewhat in response to it, today you ran away from the idea that what you were concerned about is what reasonable people would have made of the substantially legislative history that you rehearse. But what you do is talk about what a number of people said in Washington, D.C. overwhelmingly at one or another time. And from that purported to get to a conclusion about what most actual people thought. And that formulation about what most actual people thought. Two things were striking to me. First, there's no evidence presented in the paper about what any actual people outside of Washington, D.C. Thought, and maybe what reasonable people under certain circumstances would have thought. And then second, I mean, my continuing puzzlement about when we get determinacy practicing public meaning originalism, what most people thought, is this some sort of a majoritarian criterion? Most people thought this in comparison with something else. How much do the numbers matter? And how can you be confident about what the numbers are? And then third, very quickly, and I think related, I'm puzzled about the relationship between what you present as meaning and what you, like other public meaning originalists, treat as expected applications, with the thought being that expected applications are different from meaning. So there are some parts of the paper in which you say, well, the equal protection clause can't mean certain things because certain people didn't expect it to mean that. So for example, it can't have any application to voting rights. But then in other parts of the paper, you seem to say that the equal protection clause can have meanings that I think would probably have been very surprising to most people at the time without having done the work, such as, for example, that it could entail a right to a paid lawyer.
Okay, so I really like the paper, and actually my comments are sort of somewhat similar to the prior two. So I echo the praise of the paper, but I too was confused, and I guess I wasn't the only one as to the relationship between the letter and the spirit part. And maybe I can sort of put this a little bit differently. My understanding about the letter and the spirit theory is that the letter is telling you the original meaning, and then we resolve the uncertainties that remain after we've explored the letter with the purpose or with the spirit. So I think it would be helpful if you, at the end of the letter section, sort of list out what you think you've established and what you think remains open. That would be sort of really helpful to know, because you discuss a lot of evidence, and then some of the evidence gets reintroduced at the spirit stage, and it's just hard to know why things are being included or excluded. So if you sort of said, all right, this is what the letter tells us, and this is what's left open. All right, now I'm going to go into the spirit and choose amongst the possibilities. That would have been very helpful to me, and I think I would have learned a good bit more from that. And I think that's sort of eminently doable. I guess I have a lot of other points, but let me just raise a sort of second question, which is not methodological. So I guess I'm wondering about the protection point, and your statement that this doesn't just guarantee equal protection in the sense that Michael McConnell was saying, but all protection. So I guess my question is, my sense is that you're interpreting the clause to say no state shall deny to any person the protection of the laws. I mean, how would that differ from your interpretation. And of course, they didn't say that. They said the equal protection of the law. So I'm sort of wondering why the language doesn't actually point us in the direction of Michael McConnell's interpretation.
Let me begin by just saying, Larry, I agree with everything that you said, and I will get to that. I think I may have been too willing to slice things down by way of fitting things within an optimal word count for submission, and I do need to elaborate my methodological premises in more detail, because everything you said, yeah, that's totally cool. Richard, a couple of things. I'll start with the question of expected applications. I don't say that people didn't expect voting rights to be covered by this clause. I focus on the fact that they repeatedly and consistently said that it wouldn't in connection with its framing and presentation for ratification. And I argued that that affects the conceptual content that was conveyed to the public. So it wasn't a matter of disappointing expectations. It's what they said. What people said affects what is heard and what's received in the meaning of language. And that's where I'm going with those comments about voting rights. With respect to actual people, because it is impossible to know how every actual person received a particular piece of communication at a particular time, you've got to rely upon proxies and you've got to generalize. I went through newspapers, I went through records of colored people's conventions, I went through legislative history, I went through the Joint Committee on Reconstruction's reports, and I generalized on the basis of what I found. Somebody who thinks that I haven't captured enough about what actual people thought is free to present evidence indicating that there were variations in the way that the relevant constitutional language was received. I tried to acknowledge and say, notwithstanding the fact that there was a distinctive strain of general anti-discrimination theory that was operating, the weight of the evidence points in a particular direction. And yes, with respect to the operative linguistic theory that I'm deploying here, it is a majoritarian one. I am looking for what a majority of people thought about the meaning of the constitutional text, because I think the language is majoritarian in that way. But it was not an easy thing to do, and I am going to go through it and see that I can emphasize more that I am not just relying upon a handful of white Republicans because I think that they were constitutive of the meaning of language at a given time. I'm relying upon them because, well, there are only certain amounts of documents that we actually have records of that speak about the Equal Protection Clause, and they happen to dominate discourse at a particular point in time. With respect to, let's see if there was anything else there. Mike, building upon Mike's point about equal protection, yes, the fact that it says equal protection rather than protection of the laws was something that bothered me. However, I think that the best way to understand that is emphasizing the fact that it needs to be equally available to all, not that you could somehow deny protection to everybody, and that would somehow comport with the concept of the protection of the laws. There's no reason to think that the lack of any protection for anybody would have been more beneficial to, or perceived to be as more beneficial to anyone than the lack of protection for just some. So to the extent that there's any ambiguity there, I think that, again, the purpose of this provision counsels in favor of reading it in the direction of general protection rather than allowing for the possibility that a state could entirely deprive everybody of protection and have that be constitutional.